Good morning everyone. Today we will be studying about quality and safety management. So in this module, in this subject, we are going to deal with what is meant by quality and how we are going to do the safety management during the resource allocation. So what is meant by a resource? So resource means an economic or productive factor required to accomplish an activity or as means to undertake an enterprise and achieve desired outcome. So we all know what is a resource. Resource means it will be economically or a productive factor that we are purchasing or we are taking it to accomplish an activity. That is what means a resource. So the three most basic resources are: one is land, labor and capital. Land means you all know, if we want to do a natural resource, so it's used in the production process, there should be a proper land should be there, or forest or mineral or oil deposit should be there. And next thing, in order to go ahead with the activity, we need labor. So for that, physical and mental talents of individuals are required. So each labor, when we select, we should check whether they are physically capable and mentally capable to do that particular activity. Third one is capital. So if we want to construct a building, of course we need the capital. So if we have money, then only we can go ahead with the purchase of tools, machinery and other productive equipments. Coming to the other resources, what we are required in project management is budget, people, technology, time, space, tools and equipment. So first, coming to the resource allocation. What is mean by resource allocation? It is used to assign the available resources in an economic way. So what are the resources we are having in hand? Maybe it will be labor, maybe it will be the materials or capital, whatever it is. So those resources we have to allocate in a particular way that it should give a economic value, like economically it should be less. So economic way we have to assign the available resources. That is what called a resource allocation. In the resource allocation plan, there are two things. One is the basic allocation decision, second one is a contingency mechanism. First, going to the basic allocation decision. So in the basic allocation decision, we are going to do first one, the choice of which item to fund in the plan. Which are the item we required funding? So maybe more cost equipments or instruments are required. At that time we can go ahead with the funding process. And what level of funding it should receive? It should be from a private agency or it should be from a government agency. And which to leave unfunded, that is very minority things, like very least we are using, those resources can be go ahead with the unfunding process. The resources are allocated to some item and not to others. So based on this we have to allocate the resources based on the priority and based on the funding we have to check it out. Second one is contingency mechanisms. So there is a priority ranking of item excluded from the plan, showing which item to fund. So as I told, which is having more priority or which one the funding facility we have to look at and we have to categorize it and we have to go for the funding. So that is what priority ranking means. And the other item which are scarce or which does not want funding, that is called as the another priority ranking, that funding is not required for such type of ranking. So this is one example showing the resource allocation for the job. Here we can see there are three jobs are mentioned here in the diagram. So in that, one night plan is there. So we are giving a night plan and we have a total 100% of the resources are there. From that 100%, we are allocating 60% of resources to the DW consumer group, and the 30% is allocated to OLTP consumer group and 10% to other consumer group. So this is what we are. DW means data warehouse and OLTP means online transaction processing. So if we have 100% of resources, we have to allocate them to the different categories based on the requirement. Coming to the steps of resource allocation. So how we are going to allocate the resources? What are the steps we have to do? First, divide the project into task or number of activities. So first we have to divide our project. So if our project is of 6 months or 1 year, we have to divide it into task or number of activities. Second one, assign the resources. We have to assign the resources for each task. Determine the resource attribute. We have to see the characteristics, whether resources are repeating or not, whether unwantedly we are giving the resources, whether in required quantity, all those things we have to check. Fourth one, resource leveling. For resource leveling, same thing for the particular activity, how much is the resource given. So if more is there, we have to take it back. Reallocate as necessary. If it is necessary, we can reallocate it. Track the resource utilization based on the performance, effort and the time available. We have to track how much is the resource utilized. So this is what the steps of resource allocation. So in resource allocation, there are two methods. First method is it's divided into two. First is resource smoothing and second is resource leveling. Coming to the resource leveling and resource smoothing, the resource optimizing technique are available as schedule tools to project manager to effectively create a viable schedule during develop schedule planning process of project schedule management. So these are the two techniques we are utilizing for a project schedule management. So what is meant by resource leveling and why it is required? There could be times in your project when only the resource A can perform a certain activity. If there are two parallel activities in the project network, A cannot be assigned to both of them. So for example, you can see here, this is a path diagram. So in this path you can see starting and it's divided into AD and A is allocated to C and B. So at a time an A is allocated to both places. So the resource A is not sufficient or not it is not sufficient to allocate to both C and B, means we should not do that. So we have to check those things, whether A is required for both C and B or only C or only B. That is what I had told here. There could be times in your project when only the resource A can perform a certain activity, but two parallel activities in the project network diagram. So I had shown you the project network diagram. A has been assigned to both. So if A can't be assigned to both, we have to remove either C or either B. Okay, this is what means resource leveling. Resource leveling evaluates all the resources to see if the network diagram or the critical paths needs to change. So we have to check whether the network diagram has to modify or the critical path has to change. Critical path means it is a longest path. So in that we have to see whether the network diagram has to modify. If we remove C or B, how we will modify. All those things has to be identified in resource leveling. This is done to accommodate resource assignment, dependence and ensuring resources are not overbooked. Resource leveling may result in change of total project duration. So when we modify, for example, that C and B, if we modify, maybe after B we are going to keep the C activity, so the duration of the project may increase because of the we are keeping C after B. So critical path may also increase. So all those, the complete network diagram, the change will be happening. So this is what called resource leveling. So a technique in which start and finish date are adjusted. So in the resource leveling, we are going to adjust the start and finish date of the activity. So based on the resource constraint, with the goal of balancing demand for resources with the available supply. So based on the resource constraint, there will be some constraints, there will be less resource will be there or more resources will be there. If there are less resources, we are going to adjust the resources based on the constraints. So at that time the network diagram may increase or decrease. So critical path may get longer or shorter. So there will be some modification in the start and finish date of the activities. So resource leveling in project management is defined as a technique used in which the start and end date are regulated. It aims to balance demand for sources within the available supply. So whatever supply we are having, within that we are trying to control our resources. We are balancing our resources. So there will be some softwares to do the resource leveling also. So in resource leveling, critical path, it can be changed. It's a commonly used technique by project manager. Both it represents the longest and shortest time interval in the network diagram, and finally using this technique focus on resource scarcity. So here we can see the critical path. So critical path means it is the longest path from start to finish. So which is the longest path coming in the project will be taken as the critical path. So in the resource leveling, when we are doing this, done when the availability of resources is constrained. If the resources are less constrained, we will go for resource leveling. When resource availability is less than required, we delay the activity with larger float. If two activities require same resources with less duration is chosen for resource allocation. So I had already explained all those things. And what are the steps involved in the resource leveling? How we are going to do the resource leveling? First, we have to lower the peak requirement by strategizing the resources. We have to rearrange the activity based on descending order with high float, and finally with the high float assign resources. So the resources are assigned to activity with high float and lower the high peaks by using free float. So finally we have to find the critical path. That means first we have to see what are the resources we are in hand, and finally we have to modify the activities based on the resources in hand. At a time, two activities we should not keep, so we have to rearrange it accordingly, and finally we have to see the critical activities. Second one in the resource allocation is resource smoothing. So in the resource allocation there was two, resource leveling and resource smoothing. Leveling I had completed. I'm next coming to the resource smoothing. When is resource smoothing done? If project duration is a constraint. So resource smoothing is once resource leveling is done, after that only we are going with the resource smoothing. So after the completion of leveling, we will go with the smoothing process. Resource smoothing is done to ensure that resource utilization is more or less similar across the project. So resource smoothing will not change the total time project duration. That is what the difference between leveling and smoothing. Leveling project duration will change, but in the case of smoothing, it won't change. A technique that adjusts the activity of schedule model such that the requirements for resources on the project do not exceed certain predefined resource limits. So this is what means resource smoothing. So in the smoothing, we will be using the smoothing using some optimization tool like project management tool, that is resource optimization technique. And also we will be using this resource smoothing only after completing the resource leveling process. It aims to finish the project or activity in a given time period while preventing any unnecessary resource demand. So time is an important constraint here, and therefore no activity can be delayed more than the float. So how we are doing the resource smoothing? We have to locate the minimum resource requirement period, and activities have to be shifted according to the float available and resource requirement. Coming to the steps involved, first we have to list out the resources in our hand, and then we have to identify the important resources, and the resource profile we have to prepare in the form of a histogram. Then the periods of peak and low demand should be identified, and we have to try to lower the peak and fill the trough. And finally, the resources are in plenty, make the demand as uniform as possible using float. So here is a network diagram. You can see the up and downs there. In the resource leveling, we can see that it is almost leveled, but there are more time duration, like 5 days are coming. So in the 5 days, up and downs are more, right? So first we can see in the line, and second one little bit down, third one is more down. So in the second diagram. So coming to the third diagram, we are just smoothing the up and downs and making it into a level. So we are not changing the project duration. So it is 5 days only. We are not changing the project duration, and we are just smoothing the up and downs. So and you can see only the fourth day is coming in a different level. All other days are in a almost same level. This is what called resource smoothing. The comparison between leveling and smoothing. In the case of leveling, primary constraint is resource availability, but in the case of smoothing, primary constraint is the time. Then in leveling, project start and end dates can be adjusted, but in smoothing we are not going to change any end date here. And resource leveling, critical path can change, and smoothing we can't change the critical path. And tasks can be delayed beyond the float period in leveling, and tasks can only be delayed within the float period in smoothing, and used when there is an over allocation of resources, and used when there is an uneven allocation of resources. In the case of resource leveling, used at the beginning of the resource optimization process, but smoothing is only done after the resource leveling is completed. So this is what the comparison between leveling and smoothing. I hope you all understood about the resource allocation, and in the resource allocation about resource leveling and smoothing. Thank you everyone. We will come to the next class.